Life growing up was adventurous. I lived on a farm and every day looked like an adventure. So my parents split up when I was around about 12. I was definitely a daddy's girl, so Dad would be on the dingo and the tractors and doing all this landscaping, and so I was a little helper ever since I was 2 years old. I'd be coming along with all the little trips. My dad was quite a big, very strong man, and he was always the one helping others, and the first stroke that he had was the first of many, which wasn't expected at all since he was very healthy and very fit. Up until the age I was 19, 20, he had had a heart bypass. He had over 12 strokes and heart attacks. The last time he fell, I just thought, oh, well, Dad's Dad, and so he's going to come back stronger than ever as per usual, but this time wasn't the same. In the morning is when I went over to see him, and then they realised that it was a stroke. Once they had realised it was a stroke, the ambulance was called, and I hopped into the ambulance with my dad on the way to the hospital. The rest of my family met us there, and so once we were there, we were talking about what happens if he passes away. I just asked if I could have like a moment just with Dad, me and Dad, and I asked him if he was to pass away, if he wanted to be resuscitated, because I know if I said that I wanted him to stay, then he would, but I knew that that would be like a selfish question. I asked him whether or not he would want to stay, and he said no. And so that was a really tough thing for a daughter to hear. But I knew that he had fought so much, and that if he wanted rest, then it's his choice to make. And so after that, I flew back down to university. About a week later, my brother calls me to tell me that Dad had passed away. At that moment, I didn't know what to do, so I called out, and I asked God to let him in, because I didn't know if my dad still believed in God, or I didn't know what was going to happen, so that's the only thing that I knew what to do. I just asked God to let him in, almost pleading with him. I ended up taking on most of the responsibilities and organisation of the funeral. And the one time that I was needing my mum the most, she was on the other side of the island burying my granddad. So not only was I organising the funeral, but I'm also trying to be a mum to my little sister and mend my family back together, while I'm also trying to organise and mourn myself. The very next day after the funeral, I was back on a flight in the morning. I was studying fashion design. The very first class was what I'd be studying for the next 6 months, and so what my whole brief would be about. And so I'm sitting there, and the teacher gives us our brief, and it is about well-being and who helps our well-being. And so the teacher's then brainstorming with the class, oh, so who helps it? And I'm sitting there going, my well-being is crushed right now. I do not have any sense of well-being. And so at a time where I thought it was going to be the most painful thing to sit through, God gave me this option of like, well, you can either deal with it now, or you can push it down and try and deal with it when you're 60. What do you want to do? This is your choice. And so I said, okay, I want to deal with it now. And so the brief about well-being, I decided to do it about my dad. And so as I was sewing the garments together, it was as though I was sewing myself back together, healing the wounds that were in my heart. About 2 weeks after the funeral, I am in my living room. I'm sitting there, and this wave of emotion comes over me. And my whole living room starts to sound like trumpets and choirs and things that I'd never experienced before. And immediately I knew that God had let me know that my dad was in heaven. That was massive for me. It's a blessing to miss someone. It's a blessing to have memories. It's a blessing to have someone in my life that was so caring and so loving, and it's such a blessing that I actually got to know him and that he was my dad, and that I had the privilege of being his daughter. I'm in complete wonder as to how God has brought me through and brought me through even stronger. It's as though every situation, somehow he manages to part the seas and relaxes my soul and brings peace and calmness into my world.